Welcome to AMS on the Air. I'm Dakota Smith.
I'm Jeff Rosenfeld.
And I am Irene Sands. We're here to podcast all things weather, water, and climate.
Students coming in don't have the skills straight out of school that make them successful in the first year or so of their job. If they can cut the data, understand the impact of the information, and then communicate that to somebody who doesn't understand any of that stuff, they've got a great career ahead of them.
Today we're talking about something that I think is on a lot of people's minds because the field is changing so fast in meteorology and sciences in general that I think are catching a lot of schools off guard in terms of what they're offering and catching students off guard in terms of what they need to emphasize to prepare for jobs, especially in the private sector. And it kind of brings up some old issues for me, actually. I remember in school, I wasn't sure what to take one semester, and I remember my dad, who was an engineer, told me, look, whatever you do, just take a class in thermodynamics. And I was like, what? I at the time, I wasn't really majoring in anything scientific at all. And he said, whatever you do, you'll never regret. That's the one thing you'll never regret is having thermo. Like, that's basic to almost everything in life. So take it. And I think what was really interesting about that is he was absolutely right, especially later on. And yet what it also showed is that when you're in college, sometimes you're making these decisions that seem kind of out of left field, like, oh, I'm interested in this, I'm just going to take that, or I don't know what I want to do, but this looks like fun. But there's some things that really do give you that flexibility to jump into all sorts of different things later in life. And if you don't have it, it's a limitation. And it's really hard to know what those things are. You need people to help guide you. And I think at the AMS meeting in Phoenix, this issue came up over and over again. Like, what kind of guidance do we need to be giving students? And Irene, maybe you could shed a little light on this. I mean, you've navigated your way through a field that's changing so rapidly, and even in the short time that you've been, out of college and as a professional, what have you seen?
I graduated in '08, and I feel like if I were to be graduating now, 11 years later, it's a whole different field besides the fact that I sent DVDs, and I'm sure the people before me sent tapes, the way of applying for a job is different, especially now. Just the schooling that you do, you have to learn. I feel like right now, and I've mentioned this to Dakota before, you have to diversify yourself so much if you want to put it lightly, stay alive in the field, especially if you're working in broadcast. If you're working in broadcast, you need to be a good communicator. But you also need to know digital. If you know how to program, even better, because you might need to, run some CSV files or run your own program for whatever it is that your station needs. You need to maybe know how to work a website because they're going to ask you to work on the station's website. So it's not just meteorology. It's other things now. And now with technology, it's a lot more if you are in the broadcast field. When I went to school, the classes that you take, I ended up not being able to take a prerequisite to work at the National Weather Service because if I would have, the space was very limited in that class. So I think they only accepted it something like 15 students or something like that. I mean, my class was a lot larger than that. If I wanted to take that class in order to qualify for a future job in the National Weather Service, I would have to wait a year. So right away, my last year, or before my last year, I had to pick, okay, well, what am I going to do if I don't get into this class? I went to school for meteorology. I didn't go to school for broadcast meteorology. I didn't know that I was going to end up in news.
Yeah, I'll chime in here. I think my thought process on this has changed throughout the last few years. I've been out of undergrad for 5 years now and out of grad school for about 2 years. How to prepare for the private sector, it's almost like you can't fully, because there are things that I that I needed when I entered the private sector that I had no idea that I was going to need. Some skills that I had that I just happened to have. Some I didn't, that I had to sort of wing
gifted.
it, learn on the. I mean, sometimes you just got to go with it and figure it out along the way. Sometimes there's just things you can't prepare for. I think what's helpful though in the undergrad years is to sort of just gather as many skills as you can that you might think be applicable down the road. And some might just be like, whatever, didn't need that. But I imagine if you're not exactly set on what you want to do, you're going to need a handful of skills. Even if you're laser focused and you know exactly what you want to do, your interests change over time, and you never know where you're going to end up. I used to work at a TV station, had no inkling that I was going to work at a TV station. I mean, that's the old trope in meteorology. When you say you go to school for meteorology, people ask you, oh, you're going to be on TV, you're going to work at a TV station? And I always said, oh, definitely not. And look what happened. So you never know. I would say prepare for as many things as possible.
Your interests change, but also situations. I mean,
that's a good point.
You might be, in my case, I ended up leaving a job in the TV, and digital was taking over. And yes, I still work in a news station, but it's in the digital department, which is laid back, hectic. At times it's more hectic than the newscast, but it's a different animal. It's a different monster. And perhaps, I don't know, maybe next year my husband gets a job somewhere else and I end up working for, I don't know, teaching or an electric company or a power company. Who knows, So situations change, and there's nothing wrong with diversifying yourself. And like you said, learning the most or a little bit of everything.
I think that's the tension between academia and preparing students for the private sector, in that I think in the private sector you do end up jumping from skill to skill, or merging skills in a way that may not happen as much if you're, say, a grad student on a very traditional path to a research position. And so schools are really good at preparing you for grad school and for ultimately whatever the next step is, if you're in grad school, to the degree and then the postdoc, etc., if you're on a very tried and true research path. But everything else is the opposite. Instead of getting really good at one thing, you have to be good at so many different things, or at least open to so many different things, and have a little experience in so many different things, like you guys are describing. And I think that's why it's so hard to know or to tell students what to do unless you know which way they're going. And in your case, Dakota, you've gone back and forth between media and the academic type of work, and that's even harder. So I think it's hard for schools to know what to teach and what to emphasize for their advisees. And we actually needed a little help sorting out these issues. Unfortunately, at the AMS meeting in Phoenix in January, there was a really good panel on this topic called Mind the Gap, which was focused on the question of what do you teach, what do you emphasize, and how do you get prepared to be in the private sector, because that's very different than what traditional paths have been in the past in meteorology. And that's where the growth is. That's where the jobs are. And a lot of schools are not prepared for that shift that's happened. So we got lucky when we were in Phoenix and talked to one of the organizers of a workshop in Boulder, which is basically the continuation of this AMS panel called Mind the Gap. Steve Bennett from Riskpulse, and Steve is hiring people right now, and he knows from that side of the equation what he's looking for, what private companies are looking for, what it takes. So we got some advice from Steve. It was very interesting, and I have to say I was overwhelmed by the kinds of things he was telling us that students need. So let's take a listen.
Private sector is identifying that students coming in don't have the skills straight out of school that make them successful in the first year or so of their job. The academic sector is, and the students themselves are the ones telling us this. So as a hiring manager, so I'm in the private sector, as a hiring manager, I see it. Like I see this from the candidates that we interview. But then this actually all started last AMS, after a panel. We had several students, and this was just like an energy panel. It was about energy meteorology, and it was largely private sector. But after the panel, we had several students come up to us and say, why don't we know anything about this? Why don't we even know this is a potential career path for us? Like we don't know. And we heard that enough through the week that we were encouraged to do something about it. And so that's where we went for NSF funding, got the funding to do this workshop. So the academic sector tells us that first of all, meteorology is incredibly credit heavy. Right? So you don't have a lot of space to go take fun classes or to take classes that prepare you for anything other than your primary degree in meteorology. And those courses are structured in a way that they meet the AMS guidelines and they meet the federal guidelines for National Weather Service. So it was really interesting. And that was the motivation behind putting the panel together. I think we had 3 academics on the panel and 3 private sector, plus the 2 moderators. So it was a big panel, or 8 people.
that is a big panel.
Yeah, it was a management challenge.
So was there ever a time when students were prepared for that first year? I'm struggling to remember what it was like to be a recent graduate. So long ago, but
well, me too. But if I go back to when I graduated, so I graduated with an undergraduate degree in meteorology, went directly into the private sector. So my first job was at Weather Data Incorporated, which I think now is part of AccuWeather. I left my undergraduate and went into a job where I was forecasting. So my synoptic meteorology was very helpful. The forecasting contests that I had done were very helpful. My job consisted of coming in, looking at the weather maps, making a forecast, I actually filled out sheets. So we had, for each newspaper we worked on, you had boxes to fill in on a piece of paper. So, today's high, there's a space for a map that then a graphic artist would insert later. You do the 5-day forecast, highs and lows. And then we actually would go to a computer to type in, you could put in 50 words or whatever. I think while my classes didn't prepare me to turn a weather forecast into 50 words, exactly, right? That's something you learn pretty quickly on the job. I didn't need much more than that starting out. I had to have reasonable communication skills and stuff like that, but I typically wasn't talking to clients. I would occasionally do an interview with a reporter. So that was not something I had been prepared for directly in my undergraduate, but I was largely forecasting, which I think my program did prepare me to do. The art of the forecasters are going away. The technology has gotten so good and the amount of weather forecasting data is so voluminous that I think a student today that wants to be a forecaster is probably not going to chart a path through the private sector. I won't speak for the National Weather Service because I just don't know. But I think the private sector, there are still forecasters in the private sector, so don't get me wrong. But I think the percentage of entry-level positions for somebody with a meteorology degree who's looking at a classic private sector job, the percent that are forecasters it has to be an order of magnitude less than it was 10 years ago. And so what are they doing? Like, what do they come in doing? They're doing business analysis. So they're coming in, they're taking a forecast and they're translating it to some specific business interest. So there's going to be 8 inches of snow in New York. What does that mean for traffic, right? So what does that mean for how quickly goods can move from one place to another? What does that mean for what businesses will be open or closed? It's not about will there be 5 inches of snow, 8 inches of snow, or 12 inches of snow. It's about what does that mean? and then typically translating that to somebody else. They're typically having to communicate that impact off to somebody else. So I just think there's a lot less forecasting. I think there's a lot of jobs now that are very data oriented. So, I mean, I think they're data science oriented, where immediately when you come into the private sector, you're being asked to analyze a large set of historic weather data versus a set of business data in some way. So I'm going to give you 10 years worth of snowfall forecasts in New York, and I'm going to give you traffic patterns on the various interstates, and I want you to tell me how much does snow impact traffic, right? That's sort of a simple example.
So what would you need to do that, for instance? So how would you train somebody for that?
So, I mean, it's basic statistics, it's basic data science. In data science, there are a lot of, that example is a little probably too simple for what I would classify as data science. That one's probably more basic statistics. But there are other problems where sort of basic data science, knowing what tools and libraries are available in the open source community, knowing how they work, and knowing which ones should be used for which situations. Data science is different than it was a few years ago, in that you don't really have to know how to program all of this stuff anymore. You just need to know what to go use and leverage. So I think someone who's prepared to do that is in a much different position than somebody who's prepared to do the 6 versus 12 inches of snow analysis.
It seems like you wouldn't want to sacrifice the ability to do the 6 or 12 inches of snow forecast.
That's a great question. I'm not completely certain I agree with that. I mean, I see why you say it, right? So I can understand where you'd say you don't want to sacrifice someone all the knowledge they need to have to be able to say it's 6 versus 12. I think it's an open question as to whether you could give up on that and have some skills on the other side, on the data science side, on the statistics side, on the software engineering side. I think there's a whole crew of students today in our society, so meteorologists, who would be better served if you could only do one or the other. They're better served to be able to do the data science versus the 6 versus 12. I was talking to a colleague who is a professor, atmospheric science professor at one of the universities that produces a good crop of meteorology graduates. And she said someone asked her what one piece of advice she would give to students who want to enter the private sector. And she said she was tempted to say, I don't think she actually responded this way, but she said she was tempted to say, don't major in meteorology.
Wow.
Major in business, major in computer science, major in statistics, and minor in meteorology, because your skill sets are better prepared.
What does it mean to minor in meteorology? Like, how far do you take it before you can say, all right, I've got that minor?
I don't know. I mean, that's a better question for somebody from the academic communities. Like, what sorts of classes and credits? I mean,
what would you like to see as a hiring manager? Like, how far is enough?
So to me, I want somebody that understands forecast data, right? So they need a solid understanding of what the GFS is, what the ECMWF is from a global modeling standpoint, what all the data sets are. So they need to understand the layers in the atmosphere, right? They need to understand, they need to be able to speak weather. So 500 millibar low, ridge of high pressure, that sort of stuff. And they don't just need to be able to speak it, they need to sincerely understand it. They need to understand the processes that produce a foot of snow versus those that produce 2 inches of snow. I think the key trait, so there's a whole sort of just basic weather understanding. Then secondarily, there is the data sets, data structures, data availability. They need to understand what comes from NOAA, what comes from the ECMWF, where the sources of all this data is. And then also probably have a basic understanding of how it's structured. So how is gridded data structured? If they're technically inclined, like if they're inclined on the programming side, they should be able to manipulate that data in some way.
That seems like a big step, though. That's a level of understanding. I'm thinking you're already pretty close to a major.
And that's true. I mean, it's I think a major that produced someone more along that line would be that'd be a very strong candidate. It could be a little less on the atmospheric thermodynamics, differential equations, physics 3. Those kinds of things might be a little less necessary.
Okay, so that gets me closer to my pushback point. And I have no stake in this except that I want to see people getting jobs.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And we'll get to that in a little bit. But let's say you do get a candidate who doesn't have a good thermodynamics, physics, whatever background, but they can talk the talk of weather, and they've been exposed to sort of basic meteorology enough to understand something about the GFS versus other models or something like that. And they've got other skills, which we haven't gotten into quite yet, but data science and things like that. All right, is that somebody who's got a good long-term prospect in your company or in private sector generally? So there's one thing about getting success of getting the job, but another thing is this the raw material you want to work with in your company long-term?
I mean, short answer, I think is yes. As long as it's a good quality individual, an intelligent individual who's capable of learning further and learning in the future, the lack of differential equations, unless that person is going into a position where they will. Now, don't get me wrong, there are people who need differential equations, right? I mean, if you plan to build a forecast model, right, you better understand that stuff. But I think there's a whole path, and I think that path in the private sector is pretty large, where you do have good longevity. In fact, I think a person who understands solid statistics and data science, who can communicate well, they have a very long path in the private sector, especially if they can communicate well. So if they can cut the data, understand the impact of the information, of the outcome of the model, and then communicate that to somebody who doesn't understand any of that stuff, they've got a great career ahead of them. There's no question about that.
In management, maybe, or in line work, like what you would consider line work.
I mean, I think, so cast it out 10 or 20 years. I mean, I think that type of person starts by by providing valuable information to some customer, right? The more you do that, the more you're well suited to lead others who do that.
So that's kind of a management leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. You move into management, or you grow. In some cases, you don't always grow by growing into management. You grow by growing a larger portfolio of clients. I think and I think those people are also well suited to move from. I mean, any private sector job, you most likely start in one place and then you move to a different place. I mean, I think this is true in a lot of places. So where you start is not where you wind up staying for a while, usually. I mean, a lot of lucky ones do, but so you start somewhere, you've got the good technical skills and the good communication skills. You establish yourself there, you move into the next position, and sometimes you're working for a company like mine. I mean, we're relatively small. We advise a lot of clients. There are opportunities for our early career professionals to move from our company to one of our customers. They may actually leave us to go work for one of our customers. And I mean, we see that as being a great thing. I mean, it's great for their career. So they go from a relatively small weather company to working for one of the biggest manufacturers in the world.
And what kind of role do they play there?
They would typically move into some form of an analyst position. So it could be like a transportation analyst or a business analyst. For us, for my company, most of our customers are doing supply chain and transportation. So the road for us would be somebody leaves one of our early career analyst positions and becomes a transportation manager for a national manufacturer, a food and beverage company. And I think there is a good sample of people who have done that, not for my company, but just generally. You can go look at, I think, people who are sitting in positions that they never dreamed they would be sitting in when they came out with their undergraduate degree.
So when I asked you what happened. It sounds very exciting because what you seem to be saying is that the field has changed, especially in the private sector, not just because there aren't forecast jobs anymore, but actually quite the opposite. What's happened is a blossoming of fields, of industries interested in weather, but a piece of weather, and that there's just many more possibilities. But it depends on a slightly different skill set to tap into that.
That's right. I think somebody who is getting ready to graduate, either undergraduate or with a graduate degree, and they're searching jobs, I think the first thing they have to realize is that they are more than a meteorologist. I think it's interesting, we did a survey at the beginning of the panel, and we asked the room what their primary source of job information was. So where do you go to search for a job? Google was the number one answer. Most of the people in the room answered Google. Probably not a surprise. But go into Google and do a search for meteorologist jobs, and you're going to be woefully short of the number of jobs you're qualified to do as a meteorologist. I think, and I know this because of the companies that I see, our customers, someone with a meteorology degree who goes to work for a company like Anheuser-Busch or M&M Mars or Unilever, they have a leg up over people that they're competing with for those jobs because they understand a fundamental component of the things that drive those businesses that your average transportation planner doesn't really have a background in. So if you have the weather understanding and you're a pretty good data person and you're a pretty good communicator, I mean, you've got a great leg up in a job that is not going to say meteorologist. It's going to be transportation planner or research scientist. I think Amazon I think they recently filled it, but they're advertising for someone to join their fulfillment services division as a research scientist. When you read that job description, they're looking for somebody with a weather background. Why? Because they're trying to figure out how to move goods in all types of weather. They ship chocolate, right? Mm-hmm. You have to know what the weather's going to be if you're shipping chocolate, unless you want to just cold pack everything, which they also are very conscious to their costs, so they don't want to cold pack everything. Your traditional job search, if you're just looking at meteorologists and you're just thinking about, even companies like mine, you're going to miss that. You're not going to see that opportunity.
Data analysis these days seems more and more to rely on artificial intelligence and other skills or fields that were rudimentary when maybe you and I were in school. So is that another area that they need to be exposed to before getting on the job?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think artificial intelligence, at least the world I'm from, it's still the future. It's not today. I mean, I think there are plenty of people who are trying to leverage artificial intelligence to do the things that we're doing today. But as we look at it, we think a lot of that is, it's just not, it's overkill. Like some of the problems we're trying to solve today, they don't actually require artificial intelligence. But I think the weather community as a whole, as we start to think about forecasting, as we start to think about sort of automatic recommendations, the world we live in today, there is still a transportation planner or a supply chain manager who is looking at a portfolio of goods going from a set of points A to a set of points B. They're then assimilating a lot of information and they're doing a lot of point and clicks to optimize their network. Artificial intelligence will begin to replace that because it's lots of incoming data, right? They've got a lot more than just weather. Right now, there's still a human in that spot. So the problems that we're solving are trying to figure out how we can apply the weather to all of those points A, all of those points B, every point in between to tell that planner what they could or should do. The more you start to automate the process all the way through, I think that's where artificial intelligence is going to be more. And I also think there's a lot on the forecasting end for weather, like in weather modeling and stuff like that. I'm less familiar with how that's going to go, but I certainly hear a lot of people thinking that's the step move that's coming is that.
Well, I guess what I'm thinking is that there's a potential for all of these data analyst jobs at all these different types of companies somehow being sucked into some greater cloud service that happens to have the expertise to map different data sets together and has way more information than even the company that does the business. And all of a sudden you're left with not data analyst jobs, but meteorology jobs is all that's left, or something like that, just to interpret and interrogate the data mapping that's going on, the big data analysis. I guess what I'm saying is that the future seems very uncertain, even in these amazing jobs. This proliferation may be a brief flowering or something in opportunities.
It's certainly going to continue to evolve. There's no question about that. It always has, I think. So, we heard a great comment on Monday where someone from the academic community stood up and said, hey, if the private sector will just tell us what they want 5 years from now, we will produce students that will be able to do that. But right now, we're not hearing what you need 5 years from now. 5 years ago, we heard everybody would need GIS. What do you need 5 years from now? I thought that was it's a great question. And we need to put together groups who are having that conversation. I just think there's not a natural place for us to get together and have that conversation. I think this is the natural place. I think the AMS annual meeting and other AMS meetings are the natural place. So then we just kind of need to facilitate them to come up. But it is going to continue to be an evolution. I think that's, for any graduate or anybody who's about to graduate, I think you have to be very well prepared for your first job, and then you have to keep learning every year after year after year, because the whole landscape is going to change throughout your career.
So that kind of brings up also the question of, and by the way, I have heard this comment too from other people, that the academics don't understand what their students need to, they can't advise them, and they can't design a curriculum necessarily. These are tough questions for them to answer.
Yeah.
But you're bringing up another question that's starting to bother me, which is, when are you getting to that point where you're asking too much, these well-prepared students, and maybe it's just not possible?
One of the things that came out Monday morning is there was a lot of discussion of, because it's such a credit-heavy curriculum, we require the students to get internships, to do outside the classroom, so much outside the classroom activity. And they have to do that. If they're going to get these skills, they have to do it, or they have to add a year to their undergraduate on their own dime to go, take more courses or whatever. I think we have to be very careful of moving into a world where we're putting too much on the student community to get what they need, right? I think we should be talking about the evolution of programs so that the students can get in classroom the time they're already paying for, devoting time to, all of that helps them prepare. And I think we should talk about evolution of the curricula in order to be able to do that. It can't all be that, right? I think there's the motivated students who are going to go out and get the summer internship and get the nights and weekends job with the consulting firm who'll let you work virtually or whatever. Those students are always going to have a leg up over the ones that don't. But I think as a community, we have to evolve to a point where that's not the only way to get the skills that you want.
So that's a wrap on the conversations we've had in Phoenix on Mind the Gap, which was a really great panel. Preparation that people need to go into meteorology these days, and especially in the private sector. Hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it makes you feel more confident, not less confident, that the field is out there waiting for you for the taking, so to speak.
And if you want to tell us your story, well, you can do so on social media. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, IG, or just be on the lookout for any new episodes that we are publishing.
For Irene, Jeff, and myself, thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the air. Happy weather!